Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started then. So in today's session, I'm going to be taking you through a spouse client file from start to finish. And it's going to be a really open-ended session. So if you have any questions along the way, you can feel free to just unmute yourself and jump in with your question. Or if it's easier, you can just send it through the Zoom chat. So hopefully everyone can see my screen right now, and it's the screen that you first get to when you log into the system, and it's going to list all the different clients that you've added in. To add a new client, you're going to go up to this add button, and then when adding any client, the key fields you need to fill out are first name and last name. So if you have the middle name, you can put it in, but you don't have to add it in order to add the client. Then this email field is here if you want to send the client the online questionnaire. So you're going to put in their email, you're going to click that use questionnaire box, and then once you add the client to the system, it's going to send them off an email with a link to their online questionnaire. So they click on the link, they're prompted to create a password just so that their information stays secure and so that they don't have to fill it all in one setting. They can come back into it at any time. And then they go through it and fill out their profile, family tree, asset, and debt information. And anything they fill out in that online questionnaire is going to be automatically populated back into your system. So it can save you a lot of time on the manual data entry, but you don't have to send them the questionnaire. So you can use your own questionnaire, or you can go through it live in the meeting with them. But if you are sending it to them, just make sure you fill out the email and click that use questionnaire box. So we're going to go ahead and add Ben. And now since today we're doing a spouse client file, we're going to need to add both spouses as separate clients in the system. So if you're just doing a will for one of the spouses and the other spouse is going to be a beneficiary in that will, then you don't need to do that. You can just add her on his family tree. But if you are going to be doing wills for both of them, you need to add them both as separate clients. And then you can link them together using the spouse client function. So that way, if their plans are going to be similar, you can sync over information and scenarios and appointments. And that way it'll save you a lot of time. So since we're going to be doing wills for both of them, we're going to add Lauren, the spouse, as a new client. So we're going to put in Lauren Collins. And then the key thing here is this spouse client field. So you can only do this when you're adding the second spouse into the system because the first spouse needs to already be in the system so you can select them from this list. So you're just going to click it and then you're going to click the name of the first spouse. And then they'll be linked together. And this means that any joint family tree information, any joint asset information or shared family tree information will automatically be populated in both of their profiles. And then you're also going to have the sync option for the scenarios and appointments as well. So we'll go ahead and add Lauren. So now both Ben and Lauren are going to be in your list of clients, and you have to pick who you want to start with. So I'm going to start with Ben, and you just click on the name to go into their profile. So if the client had gone through and filled out the questionnaire, you would see whatever they had put in. So if they built out an entire family tree, you would see that here. But if you're not sending the questionnaire or the client hasn't filled it out yet, you're just going to start with the icon of your client. And then if it's a spouse client function, you'll start with the client and the spouse. And what I usually like to do first is I edit the client's information. And there's two ways you can do this. So you can either click edit and it will edit whoever the blue circle is around, or you can just double click on the icon that you want to edit and it will bring up more information. So when you're adding anyone on the family tree, the key things are going to be first name, last name, and you're going to want to change the gender to however they specify as, just so the wording of the will comes out properly. If you don't choose a gender, you can leave it as unspecified, but in the will it will say he or she throughout. Date of birth, you can put a date of birth in. You can just type it. I find it easier than picking it from the calendar. If you have an also known as, if Ben is also known as Benny Collins, we can put that in and that will populate in the will as well. Country of birth, you can pick a country, you can pick citizenships, you can pick multiple. All of this other information is good to have on the client. You want this information on your file, but it doesn't have a direct effect on the generation of the will. so you don't need to fill it out, but it's good to have. The residency is also important. So this is just going to show for the client, not for anyone else on the family tree. And the key thing here is province. So you want to make sure the province is set to the correct province of your client. And this is especially important if you're from Nova Scotia or from BC, because you'll have to change the province here to make sure the proper precedents generate. So it'll default to the Ontario precedent, but you'll need to make sure to change the client's residency to Nova Scotia or BC if you want those precedents to generate. The city is also important. If you want it to populate in the will, you can type it in, Ben Collins from the City of Toronto. Special circumstances, this is a place for the client where you can note any potential capacity issues. So you just click off the button and you could write a description in below. So again, this doesn't really have an effect on the generation of the will, but this information is important to have on your client, especially if you think that there might be a will challenge down the line. You want to make sure this stuff's really well documented. And then lastly is just direct relationship. So it's just going to be a list of who the client is tied to on the family tree. So right now it's telling us that Ben is married to Lauren. So we'll go and save this. Now let's add some more people to the family tree. So whoever the blue circle is around is who you're adding to. So if I wanted to add Lauren's kid, I would just click once to get Lauren, the blue circle around Lauren, and then I could add to her. Same for Ben. You just click once to get the blue circle around, and then you can add from there. So I'm going to go up to the add button. I'm going to say child. Whenever you're adding a child, it's going to ask you who the other parent is. So you can say that it's Lauren, the current spouse. You can say it's a new parent, so an ex-spouse that is going to be involved in the will, so you want to add them to the family tree. Or you can say none. So they're either a single parent genuinely, or they have an ex-spouse, but they're not in the picture. They're not going to be involved in the will. Then you can just keep them as a single parent. But we're going to pick Lauren today as the other parent. And then you enter the child's information in. So we're going to call this child John Collins. Let's say he's male. Date of birth, June 20, 2000. And you'll notice that age automatically populates for you. So the special circumstances section for anyone that's not the client is a place where you can note sort of relationship difficulties to the client, but really the most important thing is this disability function. So if the individual is disabled, you're going to want to make sure this is marked off here so that later on, if you're trying to set up a Henson Trust, it's going to recognize that the individual is disabled and it's going to draft the Henson Trust clause accordingly. So that's the key trigger there. And then we'll just go ahead and add John. So if you look at your add list, you might not notice, or you might notice there's not an option to add nieces and nephews or grandchildren, but there is still a way to get them on the family tree. You just have to do it through direct relationship. So instead of adding a grandchild directly to Ben, I'm going to add a child to Ben, and then I'm going to click on the child's icon to get the blue circle around them. And then I'll add a child to the child. We'll just say he's a single parent. And then you can enter in the grandchildren's information. So we're going to say Lily Collins, female. We'll just add her in. Same kind of thing for nieces and nephews. You would just click on Ben, add a sibling to Ben, click on the siblings icon, add a child to the sibling. If there's going to be anyone else involved in the will in a beneficiary or a trustee capacity, but they're not family, or they're so distant, like if they're like second or third cousins, you don't want to build the entire family tree to get to them, you can go over to this other tab and you can add them in here so that their information will still be in the system, and you'll be able to select them later on when you're appointing beneficiaries and trustees. So we'll go to add person. Let's say Jordy's going to be a trustee later on. So we'll put in his information. We'll say he's a friend, male, and then we'll add him in. So that is the people section, but does anyone have any questions about this section or anything so far? Nope. Okay, if you do, feel free to unmute yourself or send it through the chat if that's easier. So that's people. Then we'll move to assets. And on the assets tab, you're always going to start with these general personal effects, just to remind you to gift them to someone in the will. So you don't really have to value them or really do anything with it. It's more to remind you that it's something that you have to give away specifically in the initial gift section in order to trigger the special general personal effects clause that comes up in the will. For any other assets, it depends on what you want to do. So you can have your client add in all of their assets and you can put values in and really give them a sense of what the net value of their estate is looking like at this point in time. But you don't have to do that for the generation purposes of the will. For the will, really, you only need to add in assets that are going to be specific asset bequests, so those that are going to be specifically referred to in the will, or registered assets that you want to confirm or to do a new designation in the will. Then you're going to want to add those on the assets tab so that we can do something with them in the scenarios. So let's go ahead and add a couple assets in. So we'll just start with a bank account. So when adding any asset, really the key field is this asset name field. So you can just leave it as bank account, but what I usually do is I put the identifying information right in this field so that if I'm gifting it in the will, that's how it's going to be referred to, but also it's going to be how it's referred to throughout the system. So if I'm adding like 5 bank accounts in and they're all called bank account, that can get confusing. But if I know this is the RBC bank account, this is the CIBC savings account, then I'm able to differentiate them in the system and I'm going to plan properly. You can also put the balance in and it's going to automatically calculate the probate tax according to whatever you've set the client's residency as. So Ben is from Ontario and we put that his residency is from Ontario back on the people tab. So it's calculating the probate tax according to Ontario law. Then we'll go ahead and add. And we'll go back to the add button. We'll go over to real estate and we'll add a home. So again, maybe they've got a bunch of homes and this is the family home. So you can call it however you want to. If you're gifting this specifically in the will, the address of this property will populate. So you can fill out that address field. If you're putting in the current value, again, you're going to see the probate tax calculate for you automatically. And the key thing for any real estate asset is you have this mortgage/encumbrances field. So if there is a mortgage on the property, you're going to want to put the value of the mortgage in this field right here. So let's say it's a $50,000 mortgage. Once we get to the debt section, the next section, you're going to notice there's also an option to add a mortgage in there. But if the mortgage is associated with a specific asset that we're adding into the system, you're going to just want to make sure you add it in this field right here. Because not only does it have an effect on the probate tax that's calculated, but it's also good to know what asset the debt is associated with. So the best practice when you're adding in mortgages, if you're also adding in the property that the mortgage is on, then you're going to just want to put it in this field and just don't add it in the debt section. The key thing is just make sure you're not adding it in this field and as a separate debt in the debt section because it will add it in twice. You don't want to double count it. So really just add it in here. That's the easiest way to do it. And then you can also change the ownership of an asset. So we can change it to joint. And then you're going to want to make sure you scroll down so you can indicate who the other joint owner is. So you just click right on add owner, and then you can pick the other joint owner. So we're going to say Lauren. And because we linked Lauren and Ben together at the beginning, this asset, once we add this home into Ben's account, it's also going to appear in Lauren's list of assets as well. So if we ever wanted to switch over to Lauren's profile, you could just click up here and go to Lauren, and we will see this family home is already there because we synced them at the beginning. So let's go back to Ben and we'll add one more. So we'll go for an RRSP. So again, however you want it identified as, you can change that name. The beneficiary field, this is just whoever the current beneficiary is on the policy. It's just for information purposes. So if you're deciding that you want to confirm this beneficiary or do a new designation in the will, we're going to do that in the scenario section. This is just the current state of the asset and the information that goes along with it. Current value, let's put in 100,000. So you're going to notice that that probate tax automatically calculates for you, but the income tax doesn't. And this is just due to the variability of different clients' tax brackets. So what we usually do is if it's something like an RRSP, we put in 50% of that as the income tax. Just we're estimating sort of the high end, the highest possible tax it could incur. Same kind of thing if you're dealing with an asset with a capital gain, you can put in like 25% of that gain as the income tax value. So you don't have to put it in, it's just if you want that to show, it's a manual calculation. So that's the assets. Does anyone have any questions here? Nope. Okay. So then we'll go to debts. So you can add debts in. It doesn't really affect the generation of the will. It's more for the planning part. So if you want to show sort of the debts and their values and get a more accurate value of the net value of their estate. So here's the mortgage. We don't want to add it again because we already added it in on the assets tab associated with that house. So let's just say we have a credit card. So we're going to put in $5,000 and just add it in. So that's debt. Then we'll go to scenarios. So this is where all of the planning happens. And at most, depending on your client's situation, you're going to plan for each of these 3 scenarios to make sure your bases are covered. So you'd start with surviving spouse. So you'd create a plan for what happens if the spouse is still alive when your client passes. Then you go to descendants only. So this is the spouse and the client are gone, but there's kids and grandkids around. What's the plan going to be then? And then lastly, no descendants. So this is like your ultimate disaster. So what happens when everyone's gone? What's going to happen to the estate? So by planning for each of these, you're going to make sure you're covered. What you can do, you can just start by going into a scenario and you can go through it manually. You can go section by section and sort of drag and drop and divide up the estate. But if you're dealing with a typical situation, a faster way to do it is if you go up to this little lightning bolt up in the top corner, it's going to give you a bunch of things that we call E-plans, which are basically like macros that go through and plan each of the scenarios for you and the appointments according to whichever E-plan you select. And the good thing about it is you can change any details you want. So it's going to create this plan for you, but you're not stuck to it or anything like that. So maybe it's kind of what you want to do, but it doesn't meet all the details. You would want some changes. You can still run it and then you can go in and make the changes that you want. It's just like a good starting point so you're not starting from scratch. So if even any of the details are kind of right, it can be easier from starting from scratch. So you can run this first. So I'm going to say I want a spouse with younger children, 2 distributions trust E-plan. So what it's going to do is in the surviving spouse scenario, it's going to give everything to the spouse. In the descendants only, it's going to give everything to the children in this trust where it's going to have 50% at 25 and the balance at 30. So maybe I like that idea, but I'm going to want to change the numbers. I can do that later. And then no descendants, half to each set of siblings. But maybe I don't want that at all. I'm going to be able to change it later. But I'm going to start by running this. And this is just, this little message is telling you, don't go through all of the scenarios and manually plan and then run an E-plan because the E-plan is going to overwrite everything you've done. So you want to run an E-plan at the beginning before you've done any planning and then go into the scenarios and make your changes. So I'm going to execute. And now I see some stuff has been done in this surviving spouse scenario. So the first section is joint designated assets. And if I run that E-plan, it's going to automatically give the registered asset and anything that's joint to the spouse. So if I wanted to add anything in, all I do is just drag and drop. If you wanted to add another beneficiary or owner, you would just click this and then you could drag and drop. So any assets that are appearing here, that's just showing you it's falling outside of the estate. Then in the initial gifts, because I ran that e-plan, it's going to give those general personal effects to Lauren, the spouse. And this is going to trigger that special general personal effects clause. So you need to make sure to gift the general personal effects in the initial gift section if you want that clause to trigger. And then the balance of the estate, it's going to give everything 100% to Lauren. So absolute to Lauren, 100%. And we don't need to do a gift over here because it's just absolute to Lauren, and we're going to deal with the gift over in the next scenario. That's going to be the gift over. So this one looks good. I don't need to make any changes here. So I can go to the next scenario. So I'm going to go descendants only. And this is what happens if the spouse is gone, but there's still kids or grandkids around. So probably not any joint designated assets. They're falling into the estate now. Initial gifts, we've got those general personal effects going to the children in this scenario. And let me just show you how you would do an initial gift manually if you had to. So all you do is you look at your asset on the side and you just drag and drop it over. And then you decide absolute or trust. For general personal effects, it's usually absolute because it's even got the it's got a special clause about the division being up to the trustee's discretion, or if you want to implement a lottery system if you've got kids. We'll just click on the beneficiaries line. You can pick anybody specifically, or you can scroll down and select the class of children. And then we'll do the balance of the estate. So anytime you want to see the details of the balance, just click on the gray segment bar and then click again on the gray gift bar. And it's telling us that it's a trust for the children, 100%. The trustees are the same as the executors. The duration is set to the age of the beneficiary when they reach 30. But I don't want it to do that. I want to change it so that it's when they reach 25. And then for staged lump sums, I'm going to change this as well. I'm going to add a stage, and I'm going to say at 21, I want them to get a percentage. I want them to get 25%. So that looks better. So now it's the trust that I wanted to create instead of the trust that was associated with the e-plan, but that e-plan gave me a starting point. And then there's unlimited discretion, and the gift over is set first to beneficiaries issue and then not, if not, to other class members, so the other children. So that looks good, and I would save. And because I made changes to this scenario, if I also want those changes to be reflected in Lauren's will, I'm going to sync this scenario over to Lauren's profile. So I'm going to just click on the spouse sync button up in the top corner, and it's going to copy everything in this scenario over to hers. So it's going to copy the residue breakdown, any assets that are joint between the two. The only thing it's not going to copy over are solely owned assets. So if Ben has the general personal effects, it usually sees as each of their own solely owned assets. So these are Ben's general personal effects. So it's not going to copy over to Lauren's will because they're Ben's solely owned asset. So you'd have to switch over to Lauren and gift her general personal effects if we wanted to do that. So that's descendants only, and then we would go to no descendants. So probably just dealing with the balance. You don't necessarily need to plan for this scenario. If you've got a big family and don't think it's going to get to this point, you don't have to. You would just press clear and we could clear what the e-plan had done, or we could create our own plan. So let's say ultimate disaster, I want half to go to Jordy, half to go to a charity. So I'm going to start by creating a segment, and segments just kind of dividing up the estate into different sort of portions. So I'm going to call this segment 1 for 50% since I'm going to ultimately be making 2 segments. So now I've created this 50%, but I need to specify what's happening with it. And I do so by adding a gift. So I'm going to say it's an absolute gift to Jordy for 100%, and I'll say gift over to his issue. So now I've dealt with everything in this 50%, so 100% of this 50. So I don't need to add any more gifts here because I've already given away all of the 50%. But what I do need to do is deal with that other 50%. So to do that, just click on this grayed out segments, and that's going to bring you back to the main segments page. And then you can add a second segment. So segment 2 for the other 50%, and then we'll specify the details of this 50%. So if you've already added the charity, you can scroll to the bottom and select the charity's name. But if you haven't, just go to the three dots and go New Charity. Let's say Epilepsy Toronto. And if you have the CRA number, you can type it on that line. But if not, don't worry about the ID field. It doesn't populate, it doesn't do anything. So you can just ignore that. If you do have it, just put it right on that name field. And then we'll add. So now we've dealt with all of this 50% and therefore everything. And we can sync it over to Lauren up in the top corner. So that's scenarios. Does anyone have any questions about this section? Nope. Okay. Then we'll go to the next. So that's appointments. And this is where you're going to appoint your executors or your guardians if you have to do guardians. And because we ran that e-plan, it's going to appoint the spouse as the primary estate trustee. To add in any alternates, we would just go to the add button, we'd pick our alternate, and then you'd set a condition. So anytime you want to appoint someone as a primary, just select none, so no conditions. Anytime there were going to be an alternate, you can put a condition on it. And usually what I use is if all specified cannot act, and I make sure that specified person is right. So I say, Lauren, if Lauren can't act, then Jordy. And if we wanted to do a joint alternate with Jordy, then I would just select if all specified cannot act, and then I would make sure Lauren is the specified. But if I wanted to do sort of an alternate to Jordy, then I would change the specified to Jordy so that it will be Lauren if Lauren can't act, Jordy if Jordy can't act, John. So it's just playing with the conditions. And then I can sync. So the sync button for the appointments and the POAs is in the bottom left. In the scenarios, it's the top right. And we'll copy this over to Lauren, and it will change Lauren and Ben's names. Then we've got provisions. So the first thing is funeral arrangements. So if you want those in the will, you can just type them on the line. But if not, just get rid of the text and there won't be a body disposition clause in the will. Include future members as if you want to include future members of the class in the definition. So for children, so I used a class gift to children in the second scenario. If I want to include future children, then I can click that box and it's going to say my children are John Collins and any other child born to me and Lauren. But if not, it would just say my children or my child is John Collins. Class restrictions, same kind of thing. You can restrict certain members of being part of a class. Trust for beneficiaries under a certain age. This is your general trust clause. So it's going to guide underage beneficiaries that you haven't set up specific trusts for. So the duration, you can change it if you want. It's just set as a default to 25. It's not going to affect anything that we've set up in the will, like that trust we did for the children. But if it ended up going to their children and they didn't have a trust set up, then it would just follow this. Secondary will assets. This is if you're doing multiple wills, so primary and secondary wills. Then you can pick and choose which definitions you want included in the secondary will. But if you're just doing a single will, you don't have to click or unclick the boxes. It just won't have any effect. So you can just leave it. So then we'll go up to this little question mark up here. So these, or exclamation mark, sorry. These are our advisor insights. And basically it's like contextual advice. It's almost like a checklist to make sure you considered important planning things and you haven't forgotten anything. So some of them, like if it tells you you forgot to put a gender in, if you went back and you put a gender in, it would go away, but not all of them go away. Like if there's is an RESP possible, even if I added in an RESP, it's just triggered any time that you add in underage children. So it's just things to think about. And once you kind of go through them all and you're confident you haven't missed anything, it can just make you feel more confident in the planning. Beside that is notes, so you can make any notes on your client. Maybe you want to check the spelling of a name or note that you had done a title search on a property, those kind of things. And then the last button is the download button. And this is where you generate your documents and your summaries. So there's 3 summaries you can generate. The first one is profile, and it's going to give you all the information on all of the information from the questionnaire or that you've entered for them on your side. So it's going to give you profile, family tree, assets, and then debts. So it's just going to give you all the details. Jordy usually gives this to his clients after the meeting so they can review spellings and asset information and make sure everything is correct. Then the next one is the graphic scenario summary. So it's going to give you a nice visual representation of the will plan for each of the scenarios. And it's almost like a funnel. So it's got all the assets at the top, funneling into the balance of the estate at the bottom. And if you're putting in values, it's a really nice sort of visual to give to the clients. And the last one is just your text scenario summary. So it's got all the details on everything. So who are the trustees, how you've divided up each of the scenarios, what gifts you've created. It's like the will without the legalese. So it's just got all the information in more of a digestible form. So those are the 3 scenario summaries. And then you can go to documents. If you're on a trial, you can just ignore this, but this is when you would incur the fee for this client if you're on the flex plan. And then you can choose which document you want to generate. Today we're going to do single will. You can always change the signing date or take it out if you want to. The registered asset designation box, this is if you want to include those designations. So you want to confirm or to do new designations in the will. You're going to check this off. Joint designated asset confirmation, it's basically just a clause that says anything that's joint is truly intended to be joint, not held in a resulting trust. Counterpart is if you're signing counterpart under the new legislation. Simplified is a shorter will with less definitions and powers. A will guide is a nice little chart at the end of the will that will guide the clients to the clauses in it. And then a cover page is just a cover page. And for witnesses, you can pick anyone else who's a user on your account, or if they're not, you can just click this blank box and you can enter their information manually in the generated document. And then you can just click generate, and I'm going to switch my screen. It's going to give you a Word document. So it's fully editable. You can make any changes that you want to make. I'm just going to go through it quickly. So funds and plans, this is because we clicked the registered asset box. The assets passing outside of the will is because we clicked that joint asset box. Here we've got our definitions and interpretations. My children means John Collins and any other child born to, because we checked the children box in the provision section. Here are appointments. So we did Lauren, if not Lauren, then Jordy, if not Jordy, then John. Disposition of personal effects. So this is a special general personal effects clause that generates if you gift those general personal effects in the initial gift section. And it's going to generate with this red or, and that's just to draw your attention to it because you have to make a decision here, whether you want to just leave the division of those personal effects up to the trustee's discretion. So then you would just leave in his absolute discretion, or you could take out, or you could leave in A, B, and C if you're doing some sort of lottery system or something like that. So you either take out everything from or to C, or you can just leave it in if that's what you want to do. Then here we've got the residue, so everything to Lauren. If not Lauren, then this trust for the children. And then ultimately, half to Jordy, half to Epilepsy Toronto. And if we scroll all the way down, here we've got our nice little will guide at the end of the will, and it's going to guide the clients to the clauses. And a good thing to do when you're ready to sort of send the drafts to the client is to update the field codes. So you just do something to select all. So you can say Control A and then F9 to update the fields. And that just makes sure after you've made any manual edits and stuff, all of the numbering is up to date and everything's correct that way. So that's sort of how you would go through it. Then you'd go back to the system, you'd switch over to Lauren's profile and go through all of hers to make sure that there's not any changes. And then you generate hers as well. And the one thing I want to point out before we wrap up is this little question mark up in the top corner. So if you click on it, it's going to bring you over to our help desk where you can search through lots of articles on how to do things in the software. Usually gives you a step-by-step and some pictures, so it can be really helpful. But also, if you're ever stuck on something or if you want to go through a file one-on-one, you can email me or you can email support, and we're always happy to help. So does anyone have any final questions before we wrap up? No? Okay, well, if you do come across anything later, don't hesitate to reach out. We're always here to help. But thanks everyone for joining me today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.